Howdy, Charles for HumbleMechanic.com. Today, I'm going to be taking your questions on the clockspring recall, steering racks, VR6 thermostat housings, and more. This is episode 107 of the Humble Mechanic Podcast. All right, to get a question answered on a show like this, email me, charles@humblemechanic.com, and be sure to put question for Charles in the subject. You know, I've set this up to do these Q&A shows that way from the beginning, but I have a question for you guys. Is that the best thing for you? Would you rather do something different, like a hashtag on Twitter or something like that? As long as it makes it really easy for me to search and find your questions, I'm open to whatever. So do me a favor in the comments section and post and let me know, is the email thing the best, or would you guys rather ask me questions a different way? As long as I can track it and find your questions, I don't mind doing it whatever way works the best for you guys. All right, before we get into the show, let's talk about the sponsor of the day, which is CRP Automotive. CRP deals in a ton of OE repair and maintenance parts. They have everything from timing belt kits to head gasket sets. They even give you the torque spec for the head bolts in their head gasket kits. They also deal in fluids and suspension kits. They even make the factory Volkswagen and Audi DSG fluids, so check them out at crpautomotive.com. And like always, I'll be sure to put links in the video notes for you guys to check them out. Also, this week is going to be an insane week. I'm getting ready for SEMA and AAPEX. So I'll be in Las Vegas from November 2nd to November 6th. If you guys are anywhere near there, please let me know. I'd love to meet you guys. I'll be hanging out in the CRP booth most of the time, but I'll also be running around doing other things, hanging out with some of my favorite automotive YouTubers as well. So be sure to let me know if you guys are going to be around, and if you're at AAPEX, stop by the CRP booth and make sure you say hi. All right, let's get in to your questions. First one comes from James. What's the deal with the clockspring recall and the pods recall? All right, James, awesome question. So we don't know about the clockspring recall at this point. There has been a lot of talk, replace the whole clockspring, replace just one part of it, have a retrofit piece that installs. We really don't know. I'm not even sure of the timeline of that just yet, but like all of these kind of things with Dieselgate and that whole nonsense, the clockspring recall, as soon as I know something, I'll be sure to let you guys know, because that does affect a lot of Volkswagens that are on the road right now. Remember that if you have an issue currently with your clockspring, be sure to call your local dealership. There are systems in place to make sure that you can get your part repaired or replaced if you're having an issue right now. And as far as the pods goes, passenger occupancy detection system, that's a very limited number of cars. I think it was like 750 cars. Odds are, you know, if we play the odds of the whole Volkswagen picture, your vehicle is not affected by it. If it is, you'll get a letter, and from what I understand, it's a simple module replacement. And I think that's actually a pending recall as well. So great question, James, and don't worry, as soon as I know what the fix is and when the time frame of the fix is going to be, I'll let all of you guys know. All right, next one comes from Alex in Australia. Says, I have a 2011 Polo TDI manual with 120,000 kilometers on it. I recently noticed a rattle coming from the rear suspension, as the rear of the Polo is based on the Mark IV platform Golf and has a torsion bar setup. I thought you might have some idea of what would be causing the rattle, even though you guys don't get the Polo in the US. I have jacked the car up and inspected the entire rear end for any looseness or rattling. I discovered that the rear shock seems to be loose. The piston where it enters the cylinder rattles around. They are not visibly leaking, however, being the factory shocks with 120,000 kilometers, would this likely be the culprit for the rattle, or could it be something else? Also, what does it mean if the front suspension clunks during steering or cornering? Would fixing these two issues be a DIY job? I've done major service on this car with all the filters and oil and have some mechanical knowledge and tools. Should I try fixing this myself, or should I leave it to the pros? Alex, awesome set of questions. Let's deal with the rattle in the rear suspension first. If you're seeing movement while the vehicle's up in the air, that's probably a really good place to start to repair this rattle. Personally, I've never seen the piston of the strut rattle around inside, but it's absolutely possible. I have seen it rattle at the top where that goes through into the mount and the nut loosens up. I've seen that a lot of times, but we really need to isolate the exact source of the rattle before we start putting parts on. But if you're checking that and seeing movement, that's a really good spot to start. A lot of times when it comes to rear suspension rattles, what I'll do is I'll grab a second technician and have them ride in the back and see if we can kind of isolate where the noise is coming from. Even if you can get left side to right side, that's a really good way to start narrowing down exactly where the noise is coming from. And I've had rear suspension noises be anything from springs and struts, parking brake cables being loose and rattling around, gas tanks being loose and rattling, exhaust hangers rattling. So we want to get a good idea of what's going on before we just start putting parts on the car. Depending on what speed this is happening at, I've actually held my head out the door with the door open and stuck my face underneath the car to try and look and listen to see if we could tell what was going on. Now with the front, we really want to take a close look at the suspension bushings. Strut bushings, sway bar bushings, control arm bushings. I did a video about failures of Mark IVs, as a matter of fact, and suspension bushings in the front was one of the most common failures. Do a good visual inspection. If you see any gapping in the bushings, then they need to be replaced. The lower control arm bushings at the rear are really common to split, so take a good look at those and make sure the rubber isn't coming apart. Also, the sway bar bushings, when they wear, are really good for making a clunking noise when you kind of cut the wheel really fast. So do a good visual inspection on all the front bushings, and odds are you'll find out what the problem is. All right, next one comes from TJ. Says, I recently purchased a second Mark IV Jetta. This time I bought a 2003 GLI with a 24-valve VR6. Not long ago, I saw your podcast suggesting that other viewer with a Mark IV with a 12-valve VR6 use the aluminum thermostat housing made by Eurovan to replace theirs. Even though the part was specifically made for the AAA VR6 engine, will that still fit into other model VR6 engines? I really hope so, because that would be awesome. TJ, that would be awesome, and from what I understand, Mike and the boys at Eurovan are working on a 24-valve version of that thermostat housing. Because they're working on another version of that thermostat housing, that leads me to believe that it probably doesn't fit. In fact, I went on Eurowise's page to look and see if they have another option or any more information, and it says all over the website AAA VR6. I actually ran into a review that I did about that thermostat housing on their website, which, you know, side note, is super awesome, and I'm really excited about that. Unfortunately, that's not going to work on your vehicle from what I can tell. I would wait. Like I said, I'm pretty sure they're working on the aluminum thermostat housing. If you need to get it fixed, go ahead and buy the composite housing now and get your coolant leak fixed. Thankfully, those housings are pretty affordable, and I'd hate for you to wait to replace it with this really cool aluminum housing and cause a coolant leak and potentially, you know, do damage to your engine. As soon as I see that they release it, I'll let you guys know, and hopefully that comes out soon. All right, next one comes from Christopher. Is there a rebuild kit for the Mark IV steering rack? I have two 2000 Jetta TDIs, and at around 160,000 miles, both cars had their racks leak by the bellows that cover the inner tie rod ends, either one side or both sides. I'm asking this because I've already replaced the whole rack on both cars to solve the issue, and I have one of the old known to leak racks lying around with my spare parts in the garage. I'm interested in taking the rack apart to see how it failed and if it was only seals or if it was worse, and to see if it was rebuildable. Christopher, awesome question. I have actually done some research because I wanted to rebuild the steering rack on the cabbie, which, you know, I always point this way when I'm talking about the cabbie because it's right on the other side of the camera. From my research, I did find a kit on rockauto.com. Now, I haven't used this kit. I can't tell you this is going to be all the parts that you need. Obviously, I don't know specifically what is wrong with the rack that you're talking about rebuilding or repairing, but this is a pretty affordable kit. So, you know, you have an extra rack. If you spend 30 bucks on a seal kit, go through the entire rack, replace the seals, and it still leaks, you've learned a bunch about how a steering rack works and potentially how it fails. The worst case is you still have a leaking power steering rack, but the best case scenario is now you have a rack that is fully rebuilt with new seals and is good to go in your car. And it saves you a bunch of money because even the Reman power steering racks are like 300 bucks. So check out Rock Auto. If you guys that are watching know of anywhere else that sells rebuild kits for the Mark IV power steering racks, please let us know. Post it in the comments section below. If you got a link, make sure you post that too. All right, next one comes from John. He says, hey Charles, I was wondering your take on a situation at the dealership. How do you work through or your experience with working on cars at the dealership that is not your brand? Like if someone was to maybe buy a used Chevy or Ford from the lot with a warranty. Also, I was thinking if you could do a video on interpreting scan tool data like fuel trims. Thanks, John. John, you know, right now, specifically right now, we have a really great used car guy, so I don't have to do too much of that stuff. If something like that, let's say a customer buys a car, buys a Ford, and has a problem with it and brings it back to our dealership, most of that stuff goes to him, and he's awesome, and he takes care of all that stuff. So I really don't have to worry about that right now. In the past, that has happened, and a lot of times the way we do it is, I'll take an initial look at it. Let's say it's a check engine light. I'll pull faults. I'll see if our scan tool can give us any more data. Up until recently, we didn't have a universal scan tool that'll read everything. We only had the Volkswagen scan tool because, well, we're a Volkswagen dealership, and there's no reason for us to spend, $3,000 on a snap-on scan tool to read other brands of cars. So I would initially pull the faults. If it was something quick and easy, a system lean, and I open the hood and find a vacuum leak, then we would take care of it. If it's beyond the scope of that, a lot of times we would just go ahead and sublet it out and send it to the dealership for whatever brand that was. Any time that I spend working on that Ford at a very low efficiency because I don't have the diagnostic equipment is time lost working on Volkswagens at a really high efficiency because we have a ton of information at our disposal. So it's not really ever been a huge issue in my career. As far as doing a video on scan tool, interpreting scan tool stuff, yeah, man, that's awesome. Fuel trims is kind of the area that I know a lot about. I've dealt with fuel trim issues since, I don't know, '03, I guess. And, we deal with a lot of system-rich, system-lean faults, and it's something that really gets people confused, especially when you add in a turbocharger because it kind of flips the thing all around. You have changes in fuel trim at idle, you have changes in fuel trim under boost, and interpreting that is actually fascinating, and it does get a lot of guys turned around. So I'll try and work on that. I'm not sure a time frame on that. I'll add it to my board, which is not this board, but right over here of videos that I have lined up to do. So awesome suggestion, great question, and I hope that helps you out, John. All right, next one comes from Garth. I know you don't see many Eurovans these days, but I want to replace the exhaust system on my 2002 with 100,000 miles. I've replaced the mid-muffler and the final muffler, but now I want to replace the catalytic converter and front exhaust pipe to fix an annoying resonance. I'm also going to go ahead and replace the O2 sensors as well. Question: the Bentley manual says always replace under the two-piece exhaust manifold. Is it necessary to replace the exhaust manifold? As far as I know, it's not cracked or leaking. 2. Am I going to have problems with the nuts on the studs on the exhaust manifolds? Will penetrating oil spray and an impact wrench be enough, or will I need to use an oxyacetylene torch or the Mini-Ductor? Question 3, have you tried the Mini-Ductor? It seems pricey, but safer than a torch. All right, let's work backwards, Garth. I haven't tried that Mini-Ductor, but that thing seems awesome. And if I lived up north, I would absolutely buy one because it seems to be a great solution without having an open flame underneath the car or underneath the hood. As far as having problems with the exhaust studs, maybe. It depends on your location in the country. Down here in the south, we don't have a ton of problems. I really like to use PB Blaster as a penetrating oil. It works incredibly well. There's been very few times where that hasn't done what I needed it to do. And I also do like to use an impact wrench. You have to be very careful and, very good finger control on the trigger of your gun. You don't want to just wrap it all the way out. You can really run the risk of breaking the stud. So don't be in a hurry, take your time. You can even spray it with penetrating oil to get the engine hot and try it that way. That tends to help as well. Kind of a replacement for the oxyacetylene torch or the Mini-Ductor. But I like PB Blaster. It's the one we use at the shop. Your 2002 is now 14 years old. That's a lot of time on the road, so it's absolutely possible that you may run into some severe rust issues. As far as always replacing the exhaust manifolds, I've never ran into that. I've replaced exactly 0 exhaust manifolds. Well, I take that back. I replaced exactly 1 exhaust manifold set on a VR6, and that was because I was putting a performance header on it, not because there was any issue with those two-piece exhaust manifolds. If you're going that far, it might not be a bad idea to put gaskets on it, but I've never ran into a situation that would lead me to always replace those parts. If the Bentley manual says to always replace them, there's probably a reason, and maybe over time they get warped or, the high oxidation level because those are cast. But I don't know, man. I've never ran into a situation, like I said, where I felt like I needed to replace those. All right, I got time for one more. This one comes from Jesse. He says, I have a question. What's your biggest fail as a technician? Wow, that's an awesome question. And, I've had a lot of mistakes that I've made in my career. We all have. Any technician has made a lot of mistakes in their career. Sometimes it costs us time, sometimes it costs us money, sometimes it costs the dealership money. It all depends on the severity of the mistake. I've seen guys damage engines that required engine replacements, seen guys damage transmissions that require transmission replacements, kind of anywhere in between. missing a diagnosis and the dealership has to pay for the part, completely getting it wrong, missing a maintenance thing, stripping bolts, you name it from top to bottom. I've seen almost every part on the car damaged by a technician. My biggest fail was a Rutan transmission that I sort of was the third person in line, and I'm not using that as an excuse to not have done the job right the first time, but there was a guy that took the transmission out, then went on medical leave. There was a guy that disassembled the transmission, then he went on medical leave. And of course, I got nominated to put this Rutan transmission back together and then reinstall it in the car. So spend, a day and a half putting the parts all back in. The transmission was completely disassembled. Putting the parts all back in the transmission, I get it all back together, get it in the car, and I'm up on the lift. I put it in reverse, the wheels turn backwards. I'm like, yeah, cool, I did a good job. I put it in drive to see if I got forward gears, and I have no forward gears. Another day of diagnosis and, checking pressures and trying to figure out what had gone wrong, and I get absolutely nowhere. So back out comes the transmission. I start taking the transmission apart again and find out that the very first part, there was a cone that needed a seal in it, and I didn't put the seal in. So it would have been like the last guy's last part or my first part, and it didn't get installed. So yeah, I'll tell you that I never had a transmission out as fast as I had that transmission out on that Rutan. But that was a huge blow. It didn't really cost the dealership money. It cost me about a day and a half of time between pulling the transmission out, completely disassembling it, analyzing every single piece, every single part that I had installed to see where the failure was. When I found it, I was like, okay, cool. At least I know this is missing. Let's put it all back together, put it back in the car. And thank goodness I had forward gears when I got it done. But when I put that shifter into drive and I had no forward gears, it was such a crushing feeling, and like all the wind out of your sails, all that flood of emotion of, I did a really bad thing on a big job and now the car's disabled. And that feeling sucks. It's terrible, but it happens. So what did I do to get past that? What did I do to overcome that? First, foremost, no excuses, no crying that it wasn't my fault, no making up a story about how it was the last guy's fault. I got it fixed and got the car done. Now, obviously I never forget that because that was about 5 years ago that happened. And anytime I do that kind of work, that big of a job, I'm always remembering that terrible feeling from not getting that Rutan transmission right. So I remember it, but I don't let that impact my day-to-day. Once that car was done and out of the shop, that was out of my brain so that I didn't get sucked down for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, because now I gotta work even harder to make up for that day and a half of pay that I lost screwing around with the transmission that I didn't do right the first time. So Jesse, awesome question. I hope that is what you were looking for and answers your question. Hopefully you guys never have that kind of issue where it costs you a day and a half of time in order to fix a mistake, but odds are you probably will. It's not so much that you've made the mistake, it's what happens afterwards. Own your mistake, make it right, put it out of your brain, and get back to work. All right, guys, I'm gonna wrap it up there. If you have any questions or comments, post it in the comments section below. Hey, if you like this video, throw it a thumbs up on YouTube. I always appreciate that. You can also subscribe on YouTube or on the blog at humblemechanic.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the blog, and obviously here on YouTube. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Having a gin and tonic today, no beer of the day. This is also going to be the first video that I edit from start to finish with my new laptop. I'll use iMovie until I kind of get the hang of iMovie, then I may upgrade to Final Cut Pro. Who knows? Final Cut Pro is $300 and I just spent a ton of money on a laptop, so we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, hope you guys enjoyed the show.